Welcome, everyone. We are on part 2 of our discussion on glyphosate. Dr. Bill Code will be right here beside me in just a second. My name is Kristina, and this is Dean from Australia. He was a client of ours.
Hey, guys.
But he's back home, and he's got a bit of a history with glyphosate, so we're going to share his story as well.
Yeah, so welcome, everybody. Kristina and Dean Howcroft in Australia have been very clever. They've managed to get us onto a relative split screen today, so we can do it even a distance from one another. And it's not because we're worried about Dean's health with regard to COVID. It's more because he wants to be home with his family in Australia. I was lucky enough to visit Dean in Australia last fall, and we had a great time together. And then he was over here for a few weeks, just prior to the startup of things happening with COVID, or otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. But
yeah, absolutely.
So the reason I wanted him here today was because both Kristina and I have had our glyphosate measured in the past. I was lucky enough to have mine down about 5 percentile, and I think yours was low, maybe 30th percentile. And then, I talked about other high ones, and then Dean, yours came out roughly where?
I think it was 96.
Yeah, 96.
Percentile.
So you're the winner of the most. So there you go. And so now we need to, of course, and we've already talked about it for Dean, how can we make sure that gets much lower? And sometimes it's the foods we eat. I've talked about the foods that are high. Of course, they're typically completely high in genetically modified foods, and that would be canola oil, soybean, corn, and sugar beets, actually. Whereas they're also a problem in foods where they use desiccation or drying up before they harvest them. And sadly, they do that in nearly 90% of the wheat grown in Canada, United States, and the Midwest. And it's also used on potatoes grown commercially frequently because they spray them and then they die on top, and then they, of course, store better. But in both that case and in the wheat, for example, it really concentrates the glyphosate in the seed. And then, of course, the other one, and we're wondering, this might be part of the challenge for Dean, is that they actually, when they spray glyphosate on the field, some of it goes into the water. In the water runoff, which can get either into a reservoir or dam collection, which is pretty common in parts of Australia and certainly parts of Canada too, and the United States. So is it staying there? Or it can, I believe, even get into the rain water cycle to some degree. But I'm not sure as definitively on that if we work that out, but we do know it maintains in the soil, and it comes off the soil and runoff. And so have you looked into what you might do for that? I did do some study, and it seems as though our skin does not absorb very much glyphosate. So I don't know if we have to worry about our showers that we take in the house or our baths, but we probably do need to worry certainly about what we drink. So what are your thoughts on that, Dean?
So I currently use a two-stage filter, ceramic filter, that does have the charcoal and the ceramic component as well. And that's meant to remove the glyphosate, but as you said, a foolproof one would be the reverse osmosis water filter. So
that's fine. I'm not sure about the ceramic. Maybe if you could send me the parameters of it in an email, and I will run it by Bill Shaw, because they have done a lot of testing on water at Great Plains Labs, as well as our urines for our personal test, but the water to see, are you exposed to it in your water? Because it's not a test that many cities or towns are doing yet, but the day will come when they will. And we can get a principle of that. But as far as I'm aware, the very best for the drinking water is the reverse osmosis water. And it goes to my impression, because many water companies, whether that's a great big one like Pepsi-Cola or Coca-Cola, they collect local water. They often ozonate it to kill any bacteria in it, and then they put it in a bottle. And I believe many of those could still have glyphosate in them. So that's what, we need to do some more work on. So,
and in saying that, I haven't always used a water filter. So one question I did have is there a way to determine how long this has been in my system and been an issue?
Yeah, other than an older urine sample, I don't think so. I don't think we can tell by the breakdown components of it. So that's a challenge. Any of you read that?
My understanding is because it's water soluble, it does pass through the body quite quickly. So the fact that it's coming up high now means that you are having exposure like relatively acutely.
That's
because it will drift down. If you quit putting glyphosate in the top end, the liver will clean up, the gut will clean up, and the body will clean up. It's interesting because in the sugarcane workers in the southern U.S. that use a lot of glyphosate when they spray the sugarcane for harvest, they end up often with kidney failure.
Yeah.
So obviously, we know it hits the liver and the liver enzymes pretty badly, but it also, in dramatic amounts, will progress into the kidney as well and injure the kidney. And anytime, those are our two big detoxifiers, aren't they? The kidney and the liver. And if one is down, the other one often is heavily overburdened and can't keep up. And I'm particularly interested in yourself because we were worried a bit, I don't think you mind me mentioning, you spent your time working in a coal mine underground for 2 years. And that's probably a fair bit of, organic compound exposure. Just, it even kills people if it's in the air too much, but, there is some exposure with that. And then you've done some work, certainly in the auto body business with paint things.
Spray painting and stuff, yes.
Yeah. And that's, high on the risk of possibility.
Yeah,
absolutely. It was interesting when I went back to anesthesia after almost a year off, after the third Friday of working in the operating room, my MS was worse. So, there's things in an operating room are not great for you long term, not the least of which is the halogenated compounds that we use in gas anesthetics, halothane, isoflurane, enflurane, desflurane, and so on. But also the cleaning solutions. They would take the surgical instruments in the short term and they would put them in the solution, pour off the solution, and then use them. But of course, it's hardly ever can have something that kills everything really well and it doesn't do some damage to us, tragically. So if you can take away your interfering compound and then, like we talked about last time, could be really important in yourself because if you can bring the glyphosate down, the liver may function much, much better. And I know you have 2 young children, and of course, they're really high at risk because they can't handle toxins the way we adults can. And so that might be another option is to test them, I guess, or test your own water. If you can't,
so that
the concept of where it might be coming from.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question: testing the water, and how is that a reliable way? Because actually, I think you were saying the other day that it can fluctuate in water systems. It has been known to.
I think it could in a water system fluctuate up and down, but I think now it's time for me to spend some more time with Bill Shaw at Great Plains Labs because he's been doing this probably 8 years now, I would think. At least. And so they will have concepts from across the United States and across the world to some degree and try and find out. So how long does it last in the water? If it's in the runoff and the water is stored in a reservoir, it probably persists, unfortunately, because it's really water soluble. And I don't think there's any way to chelate it out. You talked about certain things that we could do. There was a couple of acids, fulvic acid and
Fulvic and humic acid, sauerkraut juice, and activated charcoal were used in one study.
Yeah, because those hopefully bind it as it's going through the gut.
Mm-hmm.
We do know it's really hard on certain gut bacteria, especially lactobacillus. That's one of our big favorites in the probiotic world. And it has a lot of relative benefits for us within the gut, but it takes much of that system out. And the most resistant, toughest bacteria that almost thrives on the presence of glyphosate is Pseudomonas. And Pseudomonas is a real problem in, cystic fibrosis, but chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And anytime people are on frequent antibiotics, sometimes it crops up because it's resistant to many, many antibiotics.
Okay.
Work along from there.
We have a question from Bruce. Is it still considered organic if they just use glyphosate in the drying or desiccating process? No, it would not be considered organic. So farms, in order to have the certified organic accreditation, they need to be chemical free for 7 years, approximately.
You can't be using any of it on your property. And it's a good question, Bruce, because people think that. They say, well, I'm just going to spray it on my nasty weeds. And some people have even painted it on their nasty weeds. The one that I think of is Canada thistle, although in California they call it California thistle. Some people call it Scottish thistle. They're a slightly different strain. And then, of course, we used to call it, when I was a kid growing up on the farm, quack grass or couch grass, which is a very pervasive grass that grows everywhere, and it's a real bane of existence. I think one of the reasons I got a lot of lead exposure was as a kid, I was often driving a gas tractor, which is still in the times of lead. It was a John Deere D, so I'm really dating myself. Of course, it was a pretty old tractor, but even when I was driving it. And I would spend many hours because we would make over all of our so-called summer fallow 8 or 9 trips. So that was a lot of lead inhalation. And we were needing to do those trips to control Canada thistle and quackgrass. And then my dad thought it was amazing when we got that. So I left home in 71, and it was a few years later we started to get the use of Roundup, or many companies have another name for it, of course, but containing glyphosate and other agents. And then it really got big in about 1994. That's when we got a huge amount of glyphosate. Some countries, and I'm surprised Australia, I don't think has got there to banning it. Much of Europe bans it. Yeah. And we have a few cities and towns have been very bright, and they have banned it in their existence. And it's a bit tricky as a residential gardener. You have to take some training, and theoretically you take training before you use these herbicides and pesticides. But they're still, really toxic in the system. You got any other questions in there?
Yes. Let's see. Are you aware that COVID-19 creates hypoxia? Yes, we've covered that in depth in previous Facebook Lives.
And I think just to talk about COVID-19 and hypoxia, I think we're learning more and more that the problem partly for aggravating the hypoxia is blood clotting excessively. So we call it hypercoagulability. So now if people are sick when they hit the hospital with COVID-19, they're measuring their clotting capability. And most of them are getting put on low molecular weight heparin, which is what you can certainly do in hospital. And they would do that also in pregnancy for people that are having problems, because of course that hypercoagulability is a big risk factor within pregnancy. You normally become already hypercoagulable. It's part of nature's way of preserving the safety of the mom. So anyway, what you can do at home, because many of us, if we have a chronic illness, so that would be Dean and I with our MS, but if you have a chronic illness, then you have that hyperclotability. So that it may be a piece of what's making you more vulnerable to these problems. So the other part that we have learned over time is with that hypercoagulability is an excess amount of fibrin. So these are little fibrils that happen within the body. They're part of the blood clotting system. But when we're chronically ill, often they get shifted and they persist and can be as sludge lining the blood vessel. And it's that sludge lining the blood vessel, constant fibrin, that's why I've suggested those enzymes, nattokinase, lumbrokinase, or serrapeptase. Each of those, even one a day, would make a big difference. If I felt that I had COVID-19, I would move it up to probably 4 or 8 a day, at least 4 a day, 2 twice a day, to try and keep ahead of that fibrin formation and that clotability problem.
Trish says, I started partway in. What's in the water? It's glyphosate. We were talking about glyphosate.
Yeah.
Bruce asked, would aspirin help with the clotting?
It doesn't help as much as we would like. And of course, everybody's a bit leery about the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and even also about Tylenol, which in Australia is called paracetamol, and here it's called acetaminophen, because it shuts down the liver's glutathione, which you need in the detoxification process very much for handling the problems of COVID-19. So the low-dose aspirin will not be enough to handle the hypercoagulability. It's a good question, but it wouldn't be enough. In fact, even the hypercoagulability treatment of chronic aspirin has fallen in disfavor in the last year or two. The major studies show that the downside of bleeding from aspirin, either into your gut or into your brain when you injure yourself, are outweighed and cause you more problem than the few heart attacks you might be preventing. So people have moved away, and so that's why nattokinase, 1 per day, is probably a better long-term solution now than the cardiac aspirin. And it's interesting because if we take that even back a little further, we initially we called it baby aspirin when I started to practice medicine in 1979, when I graduated from medical school with an internship. And that was implicated at that time in Reye's syndrome, REYES, which is somewhat similar problem in some ways to the brain problems of other issues and encephalitis. And since then, that's been shown probably wasn't caused by the aspirin, but aspirin disappeared, Tylenol came to the fore, and probably, the acetaminophen, paracetamol hasn't done us any great favors for our health either.
No, and in my department, the digestive department, we see that NSAIDs can leave damage up to and beyond 7 days after discontinuing them. So that's structural damage to the digestive tract, mostly in the stomach and the upper GI.
Yeah, and of course, so we know that they precipitate or aggravate leaky gut because they reduce that optimal mucin and mucus formation, which is a combination of our lining gut cells with the immune system right beside them, as well as the healthy supportive bacteria in the microbiome. Yeah.
How do you feel about CBD oil and MS? I stay away from any pills because of my liver and hoping it helps with my sleep. Lack of sleep does not help my MS.
Well, sleep is a real problem in lots of chronic illness. Unfortunately, pure CBD doesn't work for most people for sleep. CBD being cannabinoid, which is one of the 2 major components within cannabis. And, it's not by accident that I put 50 pages on cannabis in my book, because it's a real help for many of the symptoms of MS. The CBD component can reduce some of the inflammation and some of the pain. CBD has the benefit, it raises brain-derived neurotropic factor, or BDNF, which makes for more neuron connections, and it makes for more new neurons. So CBD is useful in that. And CBD can be helpful in the pain problem of MS, which is a chronic neuropathic pain. But for optimal sleep, you either need some of the terpenes, and the favorite terpene to help sleep is beta-myrcene, MYRCENE, or you need some THC. So the compound that's made and available in about 30 countries, including Australia and Canada, and most of Europe, is Sativex, SATIVEX, which is 50% CBD and 50% THC, and it's used in a little puffer. Looks a little bit like an asthma puffer, but you're putting it in under the tongue. So some people will use that to help their sleep, because once you get that 50-50 combination, usually you have the benefit of helping sleep. At the same time, both the CBD and the THC are often very good at reducing the muscle spasm or cramps of MS, which are a common problem.
All right, we're through the questions, but I have a question. So, I mean, one of the ways to prevent your exposure to glyphosate is to limit your intake of non-organic foods. And I think in Dean's case, he's probably eating like a 90% or maybe even higher organic local diet, probably not getting a whole lot of glyphosate through food. But what about something like supplements?
Well, most of them will now say that they don't have any other additives in them, but it's a good question, because if people are lazy in the manufacture of things and they've got glyphosate contaminated water, it's possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's an interesting thought, especially when you're taking quite a lot of them. Yeah.
And then since you've been through the whole process of getting the organic certification, do you know if they test the water that you're using?
They don't test it for glyphosate. No, they test the water that you're using. You must have water that is, what's the right term for it? When we say it, you're able to drink it. Okay. So it must be extremely low in its bacterial count so that it would be safe for drinking. And that's an extra step. Non-organic farms don't have to pass that step, but I think it's a protective step. You would not want someone with an organic farm to be having a problem with E. coli that they happen to be growing in their pond, and then they're spreading it on the field, and therefore it's in the lettuce and everything else. Because when we have these major outbreaks in spinach or in lettuce, it's usually from irrigation water that's come from a nearby livestock feedlot or some other source, and that's why it's pretty deadly. So it's not a piece of the organic, but I know that you can't have any use of it, and ideally nowhere near your farm either. And that gets a bit of a challenge, right? Mm-hmm. Because you want to have about a 10-meter breakup from your farm area where you're growing things to a regular farm. But, just because it's not legal to happen doesn't mean that there isn't drift happens when people spray on the nearby field. And so that's an issue too. So the other challenge is some of us live, on a relative hillside. And if the water runs down and it's already got glyphosate in it, then that's a problem too. So I think there's just now getting to be enough acceptance about the glyphosate. I hope it's a piece that the organic people look at even more carefully.
Right. So all of that being said, maybe even the organic produce could be contaminated as well.
Well, inevitably is some. I mean, you can make critiques if you carefully test organic products for other components. There is sometimes components in them. It's just dramatically reduced than if they put several sprays on it. When I visited in the prairies last spring, I learned from one of my farming relative contacts and so on that often there's 6 or 7 trips on the farm each year with the weed sprayer. Okay, so that's huge. That's a huge amount of stuff. And it is millions of tons of glyphosate that we're spraying, because as we've got more resistant plants from it, they've sprayed larger and larger and larger amounts. And I think that's when it started to take off in 1994, because they were using it many more times and they were using much, much more of it.
And spraying from the air, right?
Well, it can be sprayed from the air, and it can be sprayed, with the sprayers that drive through the big long booms in the field, either one.
Mm-hmm. I know a lot of Europe has banned it, but when I was in Spain 2 years ago, driving through southern Spain, they were spraying definitely some other form of pesticide. So, I mean, on the one hand, they've banned glyphosate, but on the other hand, they're still using pesticide. And
you need to trace it back too, because if you're the animals that you're eating, whether you're eating beef, or the other, if they're eating glyphosate contaminated foods, it goes into their meat. and then we get a secondary source from it there. So that's the advantage of, organic meat, or knowing where it's been, or knowing that it's grass-fed, because that's my big preference. And we're lucky enough here, we have access to grass-fed lamb and beef. In some places we'll have it with pork. Happily, the fellow that supplies eggs to us, we've now convinced him that our previous supplier was regularly very, very good at not using GMO foods. And so now he's gone to non-GMO foods. It's a fraction more expensive, but it's very interesting that the animals ate less because they were healthier. And so they ended up, the cost of the extra food was more than made over because they were healthier, they ate less, and they molted less, and they laid more and longer. So it's a pretty interesting decision. We've taken shortcuts in the interest of the, I guess, almighty dollar, but we haven't made our food any healthier.
Yeah. There are even a couple farms around here that have gone as far as making their own feed for their animals. So I think it's Lockhead Farms makes an entirely soy and corn-free feed for their animals. And
which is great, but we're still stuck in that most of that grain has come from the Midwest, from the prairies or parts of BC, and many of those have used it in the harvest process or some other process therein, especially when we're using so-called zero tillage and so on. So yeah, it's something to be cognizant and aware of, and so when we eat oats, for example, which is one of the few grains that we eat because we're gluten-free, we buy certified organic gluten-free oats. Okay, so then you're okay in that. And we've talked before about too, with regard to COVID-19, is you want to have a diversity of grains, not just one or two grains. If you eat almost all rice or almost all wheat, or even probably all oats, then you're going to have a relative imbalance, and you're going to have more of potentially that one negative strain of Prevotella, which seems to combine and team up with the COVID-19. Nobody's talked about that much lately, but I think when people are getting a pneumonia, bacterial side to the pneumonia, it is often Prevotella, which is something that we find something in our upper airways, in our nose, sinuses, and mouth, and it can get into the lungs and cause secondary, bacterial infection, pneumonia. Speaking of oats and rice, so I know with rice, we can rinse rice a couple times and that helps remove the arsenic. Potentially with oats or these other things that may have come into contact with glyphosate, I would imagine that soaking and rinsing them would be helpful. It probably helps some. They don't use as much in oats harvesting as far as glyphosate. It is used in some other crops, unfortunately, barley. And I've never been able to find if they use it at all in rice. Okay. But they sure use it in sugar beets and sugar cane. I would imagine they even use it in Australia. Is there still much sugar cane growing up in Queensland? Yeah, up in Queensland there's plenty. So that would be an interesting one to find out, because, I guess if one goes to it, I really like the rums from Australia, Bundaberg rum and so on. But it's possible that those rascals have some glyphosate in them too. Yeah. So I'll back off until I find out. So you said you can get a secondary source, so this glyphosate continues through the system. So if you have runoff ends up in the water or the food, the animals that you eat, does it slowly break down, or is it just continually? It does slowly break down, but it's got quite a very long half-life, several days. And we always talk about something being gone. For example, a drug is gone once it's gone through 5 half-lives. Okay, so we're going to be talking probably a couple of weeks, 3 weeks to break it down. And the key thing is just not adding any more to it. Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe just for review, because some people may have missed the other session, and then you can weigh in for the pieces that I missed, is that there's about 3 big reasons that we want not to have glyphosate. First of all, it shuts down the P450 or enzyme systems, CYP enzyme systems in the liver. So now the liver has problems with detoxification. The second one is it chelates minerals because that's where it came from. It was used as a chelator to clean out pipes in plumbing. And it chelates minerals, so now you're become mineral deficient even though you're eating them. It's binding to the glyphosate and you're not absorbing the iron, the selenium, the manganese, the magnesium, and other subtle minerals that we all need. And then the third one is it acts as an antibiotic. It was patented by an antibiotic by Monsanto in 2008 or 2010. And consequently, every time you eat a glyphosate-containing food or drink glyphosate-containing water, it's like taking in another antibiotic. Mm-hmm. So other antibiotics work much more prevalently because you've got two combining in that case. And so that is what really messes up your gut diversity of bacteria, because it's taking many of the favorable friendlies and just leaving it the ones that are very tough to tough it out, like Pseudomonas.
Yeah, we should also give a mention to the shikimate pathway, which Bruce also mentioned last time. But so as humans, we don't have a shikimate pathway, but all of our gut bacteria do. So that is in part how glyphosate impacts the gut bacteria. They impact this pathway that's used by the bacteria for amino acid production. So we in turn are affected by that. And then secondary and many times after the disruption of the CYP enzyme pathway, we have so many of these downstream things that are happening. So the CYP pathway is involved in cholesterol formation. We need cholesterol for so many things in the body, including bile formation. So we can end up being bile depleted. It injures the liver, and so there's more weight put onto the kidneys, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think we haven't really mentioned it much, but, a tribute to Dr. Seneff and the other ones who, kind of early blew the whistle on glyphosate injury, is that it damages other animals dramatically too. If you use it, in glyphosate-containing food for your dairy cattle, all of a sudden their fertility goes down by at least a third, okay? And the same crisis happens in pigs. And nobody likes to hear the story perhaps, but pig physiology, especially the gut, is very similar to human physiology. So each of these, sustain injury and have problems, and it doesn't take, you turn it up in that generation and you turn it up successfully in other generations.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Bruce. Can it get into the rain as well, being water soluble?
Well, I'm worried that it can. I haven't seen a study in that, and so it's time to look it up in the rain cycle. I wouldn't be surprised that Dr. Seneff and the others have looked at that. I haven't read anything on it yet, and there wasn't anything on it when I looked at things for, writing the book Solving the Brain Puzzle, because I talk about it several times in there. But I'm worried that it does get into the rain cycle. Certainly, a lot of our excess minerals do, the aluminum oxides, and some of them get into the rain cycle.
Mm-hmm. Dean, do you have any more comments based on what we just said?
No, I think definitely just really I have to focus in, as you said, my diet has been mostly organic,
Mm-hmm.
and so the next thing is to look at the water source, basically. Mm-hmm. And there's a few things, I want to be covering this with my naturopath Dan, but exactly, getting what is going to benefit me in detoxifying these and supporting the body as it removes this as well. So as you said, the multi-mineral supplement and sulforaphane, I think Dan was mentioning.
Sulforaphane, yes.
Yeah.
So for detoxification.
So that's the NRF2, pathway, or NRF2. Those are very much in the, the broccoli group, so-called brassicas. So that's cauliflower, broccoli, a host of other ones that are in that same group. They're very high in that component. And even in the sprouting, you'll do well to eat those, because those are very much help the detoxification process. And saunas, both infrared as well as a regular sauna, is a good way to help minimize it in the body and take out other toxins.
I've also come across some studies showing that sulforaphane is actually quite good for the gut microbiome as well. So it helps reduce certain populations within the hydrogen sulfide group.
Yeah, no one wants an excessive hydrogen sulfide, and it's a bit of a lead in, because I think next week on Tuesday, we're going to start to talk about SIBO, okay? So SIBO is small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So that's something that you've got very, very good at, Kristina. And so, you know, I'm looking forward to that. I've had a diagnosis of it in the past. I think Kristina maybe has too. And some of us do have that. And part of our health journey is normalizing that and making it work. And there's things that aggravate SIBO pretty dramatically in what we do and what we take for medication and all these other issues. And it's a challenging way to feel unwell. So it's an abnormal microbiome, but this is more specifically to the small intestine, okay? And we test it with measurement of gases, for example, and one of them that we test for starting to is hydrogen sulfide, right?
Yeah, well, we don't have access
we
to
don't
a
have a good test for it yet.
No breath test yet, but you can look at microbiome testing and just try to calculate the percentages of how many are there, and then you cross-reference that to the client's symptoms.
Yeah, treat it. So that's next week's topic on Tuesday. I think one other thing that's worth talking a little bit about today is everybody is starting to talk about, in their respective province, state, country, what should we do now that we know that COVID-19 is not as widespread as far as killing people as we thought. I mean, there was worries at a time that it was going to kill 5 to 10% of people, and that's come down dramatically. It's closer to 0.1%, give or take, a small amount, which puts it much closer to a really nasty influenza virus. And so now that we've done that, and we've done that because of testing in California, Iceland, and even New York State, it's reckoned that 2.7 million people in New York State have already had COVID-19. Consequently, it's much more around us, anywhere from 5 to 20% in the population community already. And so that it's time to change all of these very, well, I call them draconian things of staying home. And when I first started to mention that, a couple of people were very fearful. So that's one reason I want to introduce the topic. I want to let you start to think about going back to normal. And I want you to let go of the fear that you're going to get sick, your family's going to get sick, and someone's going to die, because that is unlikely to happen. One of the interesting pieces I got, we've talked about ways to minimize your risk from COVID-19, and of course, controlling your diabetes, your hypertension, but all of those other things is to keep that microbiome healthy and to make sure that your vitamin D is adequate. I saw a nice chart, over 200 people studied by a grassroots organization on vitamin D expertise. If people had their vitamin D, and I'm going to talk in standard international units, so that would be what we use in Canada and Australia and Europe, of 100 or more, then your risk of getting sick with the COVID-19 is minuscule. Whereas if you're down in the lower ranges, and that 100 would translate in the United States to 40. But if your vitamin D measurement in your blood is lower than that, then you're increasingly, and the lower your vitamin D measurement, the much more potential illness from COVID-19. And that fits with, of course, almost all viruses and almost other illnesses, because vitamin D is a huge regulator of the genes helping the immune system, and it's a huge well-being of the microbiome in the gut. And each of these are pieces of having an optimal, strong immune system. And, you know, I will say again, my personal preference is to get the virus myself when I'm feeling well and doing well, rather than wait for the possibility of a vaccine and live in fear, because I don't think the fear is warranted. I really do not. And I wouldn't say that if I wasn't comfortable with myself, the people I care about, friends and family. We need to slowly work back, and that's why it's great, because the regions and the provinces and states and countries are starting to plan how they will reintroduce normalcy, because we haven't done people any great favors, even though we were tried. We started because of the information that we had at the start. Okay, fair enough. But now we know more information. The models have been greatly changed, and it's time to change and start to work back toward, and happily places are announcing it already.
I came across a really interesting article this morning, and I don't know if they'll actually end up using this, but they were saying that we can track the spread of coronavirus through sewage. So we can see if it's quite prolific, then the virus is still prolific, but if it's much reduced, then maybe it's time to start opening up a bit more.
Well, and that's an interesting idea. It really is, because we know that this is, oral fecal spread, okay? Because COVID-19 attacks particular parts of the body, the nasopharynx, the sinuses, the mouth, the lungs, but also, the stomach, the duodenum, and the lower part of the rectum, because the epithelia are affected, and it's present in the bowel, and 1 in 5 people get major bowel troubles. So if you could track it, because it's living within our gut system, and it prefers a particular strain of Prevotella, but if we can measure it in the sewage, then we have an idea how much is out there. And I think when we start to do that, we're going to find there's lots of it out there already, because this has been around for at least, almost 6 months now on different parts of the planet, and certainly 3 or 4 months in almost everywhere in the world.
Right.
Yeah, so that would be an interesting one to find, and that's something technology can do. And that will be a lot less expensive. People will be very much happier with that than testing all the people.
Okay, Jody is asking, I've been taking nattokinase and niacin for almost 1 week. Sometimes I get a flush from the niacin, but more often I don't. Just wondering, would taking more niacin be beneficial? If so, how much more niacin should I take?
Well, we have to decide why we're taking the niacin. Certainly you're taking the nattokinase to control the hyperclotability. Niacin tends to help lower some of the negative impacts of cholesterol. That's one of its main attributes. Some people are recommending niacin or the non-flushing component, niacinamide, because it improves some of our other functions within the body, and as far as detoxification and so on. So, if you're doing some flushing, I would carry on where you are. If you decide you want to go up, because the flushing, your body gets used to it, because that's usually what happens, then you can creep it up. But niacin is not useful in the coagulation cascade. It doesn't make very much difference in that.
Okay, Roger says, Al Sebring already talked to his staff about sewage monitoring.
Okay, so that's the local area that I live in, the municipality. It's called North Cowichan. Al's the mayor thereof. So that's good. We need to get people to test this in an appropriate manner so we can find. And if we can find it's very much in our community already, then it's time to open our doors and go outside. And I was reading something today that one of the very best things is outdoors, because they found in an initial study in Germany, they had a household where people had COVID-19. They went in and they didn't find it on hardly any surface at all. They tested the surfaces very tremendous. So, that would be a big help if we know that it doesn't live on surfaces very much. Correspondingly, they found that, like we did a few years ago, if you've got quality flowing air or you're outside, there's only almost 0 cases where people seem to have caught it from somebody else outside. If you're intimate and you're kissing and hugging and all these things outside, that's going to change things, because you're going to do it. But it doesn't seem to travel through the air near as much outside as it does inside. And maybe that's because, the ultraviolet is knocking it out from the sunshine and so on. Most of us are outside in the daylight.
Right. Sherry says, I have a friend who drank out of a coworker's can. Is there a chance of getting coronavirus from a single drink, even though the coworker had no symptoms, but she is nervous because of taking that one drink by mistake?
Well, yes, there is, unfortunately, because it happens in secretions, saliva, water droplets. You can be a week or even 2 weeks with the virus before you know you have it. And so if you haven't had it at all, and if you've had it, you may be, spreading the virus for another 2 to 3 weeks after you've had it. That's kind of the best guess is coming up. So up to 2 weeks, you could still come up with the virus. Usually it's within a week. But if you're up to 2 weeks after sipping out of the same can, you're probably home free. But once again, I'm not advocating COVID parties, but there's parts of the world having them. I personally would rather have COVID-19 now when I'm healthy and well. I have several modalities to reduce the problem with it. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those in a minute. So you might have those on hand if you want to be anxious about it as we start to move out into the big wide world. And so those are 2 or 3. I would suggest for sure take vitamin D, 4,000 to 5,000 units a day. And if it's children more than a year old, 2,000 international units a day of vitamin D3. And that's extremely safe. They did it for more than 30 years in Finland and parts of Northern Europe because they knew vitamin D was critically important and critically low in those of us who live further from the equator. But even those that live near the equator can still have a problem. The darker your skin, the poorer vitamin D you make. So taking extra vitamin D, and I take it year round, at least 5,000 units a day. I take 7, but then I've got absorption problems, I think. So vitamin D is tantamount I would have on hand. Vitamin C, currently I'd be taking 2 grams per day or 2,000 milligrams, and then I would ramp that up to maybe taking that much every half hour or every hour if I think I've got COVID-19. Incredibly safe, incredibly useful to optimize our immune system. That's why that initial dose, and then bump it up if you think you've got it. The other thing I would have in my cupboard now and do have is quercetin. Quercetin seems to work extremely well against the virus. And that's initial work that was done in Canada, down in Montreal, by a Dr. Chrétien, who's a younger brother of Jean Chrétien, the one that was Prime Minister of Canada. But anyway, he's done great work on it and found it very useful against SARS, which is COVID-1. And this is now a COVID-2 virus, COVID-19. So quercetin, and then the other new one that I have in my cupboard or cabinet is citicoline, CITICHOLINE. Its other name is CDP choline, okay? And this one acts on PLA2. So we've talked a bit about that in the second last time, phospholipase A2, because it seems to be very much maybe the predictive reason. The older we are, the higher the PLA2 climbs with COVID-19. And PLA2 in excess acts just as it comes up in excess in a snake bite, spider bite, bee, wasp. Those are all raising PLA2 within the body. The PLA2 can be measured, and you can get it measured in your urine, and it's probably good a long-term plan for you to do. Measuring in the urine is the one that is useful for most parts of PLA2 in the body. There is one other PLA2 which they measure in cardiac assessment because it's bound to a lipoprotein. So that's a big molecule measured in the blood. The ones I'm talking about are measured in the urine, PLA2 molecules. I think the only people that do that is Great Plains Labs in Lenexa, Kansas. And you can go for that webinar, or you can look back through our last couple of presentations and you can watch the webinar yourself. And They sell citicoline. Citicoline brings down PLA2, and that sometimes makes a dramatic difference in cognitive problems. I've always got lots of those, or people with early Alzheimer's, memory problems. Then they should be looking at PLA2. Anybody with a chronic inflammation problem should get themselves tested for PLA2. You're not going to be able to do it in your local lab. They don't do it, but it's one test you can do easily now because it's done on a morning urine.
Jody says, I am looking into purchasing an oxygen concentrator. There are none for sale privately right now, but I'm open to buying one from a supplier. Who do you recommend? We've talked about this before. Go to www.sleepa.com. So A is spelled EH, you know.
It's very Canadian. It's actually, I think, .ca, but they probably have both. So, you know, they have them, and that's within Canada, but you can find centers that will supply them any part of the world. You may need a physician's signature to get your oxygen concentrator. So then you need to see someone who's, you know, cognizant and aware of that. Or, as you talked about, you can buy them privately. But I think they're a good investment, especially for people with MS, especially for people with any sleep apnea or breathing problems at night or arrhythmias at night. I would have them use an oxygen concentrator with nasal specs at night, maybe 2-3 liters a minute. And that's what I use to minimize my problems with my persistent, you know, relative problems from relative venous obstruction, or commonly termed in the past, CCSVI, chronic cerebrospinal venous insufficiency, meaning the blood isn't draining out well enough.
Perfect. Roger says, I just got an RDRP gene 2019 COVID test that was negative. The doctor at Cowichan Hospital said it's 95% accurate. Can you comment on the accuracy?
Well, I mean, he's right. It's in the 95%. And so I'm guessing it was done with a swab up into the nose. Roger, if you can comment back, it was probably done with a swab. The only tricky part about that is it's possible to miss the region that has it. And if you're early enough on, it may not show. So if your symptoms persist, then get tested again, because I've seen your note that you've had some symptoms and fever and sore throat. So it's a possibility, but it's possible to have other viruses and problems too. It isn't necessarily COVID-19.
Okay. Carrie says, some of the private labs like Armin Labs are testing for past infections of COVID. Do you think they are accurate? As I know people who have had it, but tests come back with horrible accuracy from CDC.
Well, so it's very much how you're testing. So most of those tests to see if you've had it are antibody tests. And so they're testing IgG and IgM. IgM is the one that goes up initially because that's how your body responds to a new virus infection, a new issue and problem. And then longer term, the memory issue component is the IgG. So I think you were just talking about Johns Hopkins has talked about some of their testing, and they talk about it being at least 87% successful in predicting whether those antibodies are viable or not. The CDC has approved one antibody testing, and I know that Great Plains Labs, as of May 1st, which is tomorrow, I guess, will then have a blood sample that you can do for antibody testing at Great Plains, and I have every confidence that it'll be a quality test and reproducible. So that is available at Great Plains Labs with a blood test. That's easier if you're in the United States. If you're outside the United States, it's always a little trickier to get your blood test drawn. I don't know about the labs most places, but the labs here are trying to protect themselves and not taking any new idea clients on if they can help it right now. But Dr. Shaw also stated in his webinar that by the 1st of June, they should have one that you can do on just by bleeding onto a piece of paper, several dots of blood, so-called blood spot test. And some centers are talking about getting those so that they can read them in minutes. And they'll be able to read them in, a few days in Great Plains Labs. So I think it depends where you live, but find out if it's a reliable one. There's lots of companies making them right now. I bet you there's 50 or 100 companies making them right now. And some of them will be superb and some of them may not be. So you want them to be reliable tests, either approved by the CDC or by someone very reliable in what they're doing, and then you can get tested and see if you have it. And I'm hoping we can do that. I'm still hoping that we could do that first for our healthcare workers and maybe the people working in our grocery stores, so that they know they've had it, they're no longer at risk, or at risk of taking it to their families or giving it to someone else.
Yes. So check the Johns Hopkins report, because they've rated each of the FDA-approved tests according to their efficacy.
Okay, so that's good. That's a helpful piece,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where we need to go. And as we get more information on that all the time, we can start to let go of the fear that it's going to kill us, because it's most likely not going to kill us. Yes, we've had some deaths from it, but the deaths are no more than for a rough round of a typical virus. It's nowhere close to the 1918 flu. Remember, the 1918 problem was primarily affecting young, healthy people, and this does not. This usually hits people that are very elderly or have multiple illnesses: diabetes, obesity, hypertension, heart disease. Those are the big ones. And I suppose kidney disease and underlying immune suppression from cancer treatment, so on.
Roger says, citicoline didn't affect me in any way. How long does it usually take to take effect?
Well, you're probably going to see an effect in a matter of days. You're not going to see it in an hour or two, a day or two. Most of these, when I suggest taking a new product, a new supplement, which we know is safe, take it yourself personally for 3 months to see if it works for you or not. And then when you stop it after the 3-month trial, you go downhill a bit. If so, it was maybe doing something. If it's zero change after 3 months, then maybe it isn't making a difference in your individual physiology.
Okay, well, we're coming up to the hour mark, so maybe we just want to recap on what we discussed.
Yeah, so is there anything else you want to add or ask about, Dean? I really appreciate you getting up early to meet with us.
Yeah, no, this has been fun. So the only other thing I was thinking about was coffee and tea. Mm. If you're not buying organic, that possibly would be high.
Definitely.
Yeah, it could be high in glyphosate or a lot of things. Unfortunately, coffee and tea are some of the most sprayed things on the planet. So if you possibly can, it's something that most of us can't grow at our own, unlike our little victory garden. But if you can get to organic tea or coffee, it's probably a great step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I suppose any kind of, sorry.
No, and I guess coffee and tea, I'm still going to harp back to the reverse osmosis filter for your water source, because you could compound the whole issue. If there's some in your water and tea, and there's also some in your water, then you're lose. Yeah. Okay. So I think
this has been good.
Maybe not next week, but we'll get you back again now that you've figured out how to do the split screen. It's good work.
Yeah, Kristina the techie.
Yeah.
She's got it covered.
So, and just before we leave today, so we wanted to give you some concepts about COVID-19. It's time to think about getting back to normal. And you're not going to get back to normal overnight, because your respective region or government is going to give you guidelines how to do that. And that's still the right thing to follow, those guidelines. But I want to reassure people, because I know I've talked to some people and they're very, very fearful that we never to go back. I mean, we had a couple of people say, I'm never going outside again. Okay, but the fear doesn't do you any favors. I want to help you rationally let go of the fear. And then I also want you to realize that being fearful super suppresses your immune system. And you're going to get a lot sicker by being frightened to death that you're going to get something than what you're going to. And eventually we will all get back interacting again, and we'll get our immune system optimized. Those of us that have several family and friends around us that are eating a very diverse diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, and taking enough vitamin D, they're probably going to do well. Vitamin C and D are the two big ones. Continue to take your multivitamin, multimineral. And reduce your glyphosate intake for the reasons we talked about. And you can get a summary of both of those issues. Nothing on COVID-19 in my book, Solving the Brain Puzzle, because it wasn't around when it came out. It came out just over a year ago. But you can find it, and you can find an audio book, and you can find it in Kindle, Kobo, Nook, all of those sources. But if you want the audio book, go to drbillcode.com, ERBILLCODE, drbillcode.com. And for your friends that don't do Facebook, fine. Send them there too, and they click on blog, and they can have today's, and all the previous ones are done, as well as other podcasts that I didn't do on Facebook. Because I do some outside Facebook, and sometimes there's topics I will address that don't fit in as well in the current Facebook model.
Right, and we've also written some summaries of some of our Facebook Lives, so you can also read the summaries, and there's tons of nutritional tips and advice in there as well.
And we've got Cindy, one of our therapists also, who's an incredible food formulator and cook. So there's some great ideas there too. And our last newsletter was called Chicken Soup for the Pandemic Soul. It was how to make soup. But of course, chicken soup has a lot of benefits in it.
Right. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks for listening, everyone. And we will see you on Tuesday, next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, 5th of May at 1 o'clock Pacific Day.